Chapter 6. Lestara watched in a stasis of horror for the half-second it took to judge the fleeing figures were at least going to get down the slope ahead of their pursuers. Then she jumped onto her horse, screaming orders at her unit. "Everyone, run! For the hills! Get to the high ground!" She began an exodus across the valley towards the hills at the far side. The entire unit started to mobilize, even without having seen what was coming. The stark terror in Lestara's usually unflappable voice was enough to spur them onto their feet and into saddle. Mimi was gesturing frantically at the frozen lake, dashing across the valley towards the banks, the three other figures following her as if they knew what she was planning. Lestara, for a single moment which stretched on, weighed the options in her mind. The 100 or so warfighters in her unit would live or die by her next words. And as far as she could see, they stood no chance of outrunning their pursuers on the open expanse of the frozen lake. It was doubtful they could all reach the hills either, but at least there would be a chance for many of them to use swells and crags to outfox pursuit. Some of the enemies she had seen were humanoid. For warfighters on horseback, it would be possible to escape from them. But other incoming creatures were quadrupedal, and they bounded so grotesquely fast over the snow that it was impossible to imagine beating them in a race across flat terrain, even on horses, galloping all out. So she had to consider the chances that Mimi knew something she herself did not. Lestara grunted in fear, despair, and frustration. Given the situation, those chances were good. "Get to the lake!" Lestara cried, whipping the reins and aiming her horse at the frozen water. Mimi moved to converge with the retreating mass of warfighters, joining them just as humans and horses began to thunder over the snowy scene between frozen mud and water. She ran with them for several hundred feet over the creaking, echoing ice, then stopped in her tracks, letting the rest flow past her. She whirled around and saw the teeming front line of the dead passing onto the lake. Mimi and the others had won a small lead with the frantic haste of their dash through the trees and down the slope, but on the flat expanse, that lead was rapidly diminishing. Mimi felt Caden at her side, his body radiating tension, but standing beside her, unmovable, while the dead closed in. Mimi dropped into a half-kneel, slamming one gloved palm against the frozen lake. The effect was instantaneous. Like a shockwave rushing forward from Mimi's hand, cracks surged in the direction of the bank, blazing light leaping from underneath the snow as if arcing bolts of lightning were trapped inside the ice. The spider web of blazing cracks fanned outwards, the whole frozen lake creaking and groaning like a leviathan awakening from sleep with a thunderous roar. Underlit by the surging glow, the advancing dead slowed, alarmed by the blazing cracks crisscrossing beneath their feet. The same tongueless scream erupted from dozens of throats as the ice fractured and opened, dropping the front row of monsters into the dark, frigid depths beneath. The next ranks bunched behind the halted front line, straining blindly, knocking others into the spreading, gaping moat. The crack traveled, a ribbon of liquid water lengthening across the lake. Mimi rose to her feet, breathing hard, glaring at the flailing creatures across the moat. Chunks of shattered ice drifting through the widening gash of black. Behind her, as if sheltered in her shadow, the warfighters rushed for the opposite side of the lake, vast shifts and cracks of ice echoing cavernously in the night. She turned away, squeezed Caven's arm, and the two flitted after the shrinking backs of their allies. The unit did not slow until they were off the lake, streaming into woods on the opposite bank. Using the terrain and trees to get themselves out of sight of the frozen water, they eventually chose a sheltered grove large enough to fit them all and settled down to rest. Some kindled small fires to warm hands and feet, confident the twists and turns they had placed between themselves and the lake would hide the glimmer, even if their pursuers were still looking for them. It was a precaution taken out of a hard-learned abundance of wariness, but thus far they had neither seen nor heard any indication that the dead had actually bothered to navigate around the moat and continue the chase. Some of the warfighters, exhausted enough to accept the risk, sank into deep sleep. Lestara sat heavily on a frosty stone, sighing as her weight left her aching feet. Caven, already seated on the ground, gave her a deadpan look. He passed her a cup of water. She drank it gratefully, and Caven scooped another cupful of snow to melt by the fire. "Where's Mimi?" Lestara asked, wiping her mouth with the back of her glove before any residue of moisture could freeze there. Caven pointed to Mimi, on her feet amongst the trees nearby. Lestara nodded. "Mimi," she called, feeling as if she ought to stand, but too tired to manage it. Mimi turned towards the voice and smiled as she realized it was Lestara. She strode over and stooped to embrace the seated warfighter. "It means the world to me that you're all safe," Mimi said, pulling back and giving Lestara a steady look. Lestara pursed her lips. "Mimi," she said, "what you did on that lake, you worked a miracle." Mimi gave a small, confused frown. She shrugged noncommittally. Caven cleared his throat. "You used magic to fight that creature as well," he said to Mimi. "It took the form of fire then. At the lake, your power took a form like lightning." Lestara gasped softly. She gazed blankly off into the trees, like she was engrossed in an effort to recall an obscure memory. She cleared her throat. "Where I come from, in the marshland east of here, the Thrave is not fully established, and some of the stranded still follow what we've rediscovered of the old ways. There is a figure spoken of in legends, the Icon, the embodiment of the planet's will, manifesting at the absolute end of need to meet great threats and fend off disaster." Caven's jaw fell. "Mimi is a wild kin," he mumbled, more to himself than anyone. Lestara paused, glancing at him, superficially surprised, but on a deeper level, unsurprised. "I saw wild animals looking upon her with something that appeared to be reverence," Caven explained, glancing at Lestara. "I did not know what to make of it at the time." Lestara nodded and continued. "Legends speak of animals hearkening to the Icon's call. Some believe the Icon is simply a myth, an allegory the ancient druids left behind, which we have mistranslated or misunderstood. Planet-rending disaster already came, they say. No Icon manifested to meet it. Humanity was toppled, and if any latent force was going to arise and save us, the opportunity already came and went. Ergo, there is no Icon. And the Thrave, of course, suppresses all talk of the Icon whenever it catches wind of it, because such an idea is blasphemous to them. But now, naysayers aside, I believe the answer is before us. There is an Icon, Mimi. She is you." Mimi stared, lips slack, breath curling in the air. "The planet's will," she droned. "I fight without weapons. I fight to protect. The Aurora is my sister." She shook herself, blue eyes sharpening. "The danger is upon us. Cut to my bones, and you will find my vow etched there upon them. I exist to stop the monsters we have seen." Lestara's breath caught in her chest. She lurched forward, sliding off the stone, dropping into a deep bow at Mimi's feet. "I do not understand the horrors we have encountered, but I know the world itself has stirred to meet them. Through you." Mimi stooped and helped Lestara to her feet, with a slightly pained, bashful smile on her face. She glanced at Caven and was noticeably relieved to see he had not bowed. "Please," Mimi said. "I know I must do this, but I do not know how to do it." "I will help you find out," Lestara said. in whatever way I can, and I'm sure Caven will also. Mimi and Lestara turned to Caven, both sets of eyes fixed on him as he stared back, impassive, through his mask. After a silent pause, he drew a deep breath and reached towards Mimi. "May I borrow the coin I gave you?" Without a word, Mimi retrieved the coin and chain from inside her own jacket and passed it onto Caven's upturned palm. He closed his gloved fingers around the coin, head bowed in the starlight, face unmoving. "I vow to see your mission done. It does not matter what that takes. It does not matter what is asked of me." Caven opened his fingers and returned the coin to Mimi. Reverently, she took it in both hands and slipped the chain once again over her head. Mimi hesitated, eyes on the snowy ground, as if considering how to respond. Finally, she said, "I am bound to you, Caven. We will always save each other. That's why I appeared on the rim of that ravine." Caven's posture straightened, increasing his height even more. "To save me." "What would have happened if I had not joined you?" "All of us would have died tonight, more than once." "Yes. I believe that's why I manifested when and where I did. I didn't understand it then, but it was for you. I know somehow that without you, I cannot do what I must." "We are indeed indebted to you, Icon," a voice said, breaking a short, thoughtful silence. Mimi, Caven, and Lestara turned to look. They saw once again Nakata step forward from immediately outside the circle of firelight. Nakata bowed his head. "What you worked for us was truly a miracle. But this company has not been saved yet. Not really." Lestara nodded slowly. "We need food. We need a secure place to rest. Winter is upon us and we cannot go roving aimlessly. Unless we can regroup with the main force, we are only delaying the inevitable." Nakata shook his head. "The main force gave us up for dead already. Why else would they have left us in that ravine without the slightest attempt at rescue or relief? And even if we wanted to go back to them, it is not possible from our current position. Monsters fill the valley between us and where we last knew our allies to be in camp." "He speaks the truth," Caven said softly. Lestara glanced at him. Her face would have been unreadable, except that she chewed her lower lip. "Yes, we must see to our own immediate needs first," Lestara said finally. "After that, we can worry about rejoining the rest of the battalion. For now, we need to seek a settlement where we can sojourn, reconstitute, and resupply. Somewhere near enough that we can reach it in our present condition, but far enough away that we won't unwittingly walk into steadings hostile to us and sympathetic to our enemies." "The town of Deepwater," Caven said, "is nearby, and it is a trading hub, known to maintain neutrality in regional conflicts." Lestara shrugged. "Then Deepwater is where we shall go. We must not waste any of the night. Our movements will be safer shrouded in darkness. Wake the sleeping. We leave at once." The weary company tramped onto a high ridge, commanding a view of the landscape all around. As they ascended the upsweep of the rocky ground, they saw the smaller of the moons had begun its own ascent over the horizon, its aura diminishing the stars around it, flooding the basin of storms with mellifluous light. A spattering of clouds cast crawling shadows on bare trees below, stretched across hills. Mimi stood at the crest of the ridge, wide-eyed, gazing in awe at the moonrise. Like mismatched eyes in a tilted face, the large and small moon gazed back from the starry vault. The black blot of a gigantic bird crossed the sky silently, too far away to be terrifying, uninterested in the people on the ridge. Caven studied the landscape, orienting himself despite the fogginess in his exhausted brain, and the couple of desperate, instinctive sprints in random directions which had brought them to this point. Relieved, he confirmed to himself they were more or less where he thought they were. With the elevation, he could also look back and note happily that there was no sign they were being pursued. The dead had, for whatever reason, evidently broken off the chase. Caven's tactical overlay did not highlight a single threat in the woods he overlooked. The river snaked across the landscape north to south. At an oblique angle to the water, a road was visible, a ribbon of ground bare of trees but covered in snow. At one point, the road intersected with the river. Caven knew there was a shallow stone ford there, where people and pack animals could walk across submerged stepping stones in little more than ankle-deep water, but because nothing of the ford broke the surface, it was invisible from the ridge above. Nonetheless, the river current was so slowed by the presence of the ford that the surface of the water was frozen in patches of ice beyond that point. In the middle of the landscape unfurled before them, they saw the medium-sized, sleeping town of Deepwater. Dozens of structures clustered by the banks of a frozen lake, forests half encircling its palisades. The lake itself resembled a gouge left in softwood by a fingernail, with the river entering and exiting the lake at the broad end farthest from the town. The water body tapered to a point at the other end, cutting into the land like the tooth of a saw. The village huddled at one bank below the point, the backs of houses towards the water, the fronts towards the road and forest, so they could see strangers coming when the gates and the palisades were open. If some of the structures were homes and others were cattle sheds, they were largely indistinguishable from each other. Only one structure broke the cramped, shabby mold of the rest. Centrally located, it was larger and taller than anything nearby, and Caven knew it was the local Thrave. He could see no holy sigil or insignia marking it as a church, but the bare fact that it was grander than the other buildings in the huddled town made it obvious what it was. The road passed through Deepwater's gates, becoming the town's cobbled thoroughfare for a stretch, before exiting and cutting into the trees. It extended away, out of Caven's view, without encountering any other landmark. It was difficult to judge distances over the undulating terrain, but Caven guessed there were only a few miles left to walk from the ridge to Deepwater. As he stared at the town below, Mimi stepped beside him, following his gaze to the moonlit cluster of structures. "Is that where we're going?" Mimi asked. "It is," Caven said. Mimi gave him a steady look. "In that case, I'll be the first one there." Unhesitatingly, Mimi began to pick her way down from the prominence. Because they were leaving the shadowed side of the ridge behind, the snowy, rocky path was now illuminated by moonlight. She moved with childlike abandon, as if expecting Caven to rise to the challenge and race her towards the town. The tired, hungry warfighter did not, and watched her go with quiet surprise. Lestara paused beside Caven, taking the spot Mimi had occupied. Being led by the reins, her horse paused astride behind her obediently. Lestara and Caven watched Mimi descend the snowy path, stumbling every so often, each time continuing without any noticeable dampening of enthusiasm. "To have that energy," Lestara said, smirking. Her empty stomach did not audibly growl, but her meaning was there all the same. Caven shook his head. "Given the things I have seen from the icon," he said, "for her to also be childish is unexpected." Lestara shrugged. "Why shouldn't she be childish? She was only born earlier tonight." Caven glanced at Lestara, meeting her eye, saying nothing. He contemplated her words. The bulk of the unit began cresting the ridge and continuing down the far side. Caven and Lestara fell in with the straggly line, proceeding towards the Occitan tree-thronged settlement of Deepwater. The vagabond's boot crunched into shin-deep snow as it moved for a better look at the black rift of open water in the frozen lake before it, visible in the moonlight. It tilted its masked head. A second vagabond turned towards the creature waiting at its elbow, like a doting, attentive servant. The slack face of a dead human warrior peeked from knotted vines, woven together like a muscular new neck, nearly enveloping the old head of the corpse. A tulip-like face was inclined at the top of that neck, staring at the vagabond. Wordlessly, the vagabond expressed its desire to know what had happened. In response, a stream of images flitted into its mind as the waiting creature disgorged its memories in a jumble for the vagabond to parse. A group of humans dashed through the moonlit forest as the creatures gave chase. They broke from the tree line, spilling down a hill towards the valley. They veered towards the lake as if in a blind, irrational panic, getting onto the icy surface, though they were certain to be run down by their pursuers there. One of the humans turned and faced the incoming mass of creatures. No, not a human. The thing in the shape of a girl dropped to one knee, slammed her hand down, and unleashed a torrent of blazing power which shattered the ice in a vast swath. Some of the creatures dropped into the black, frigid water, unable to react in time to save themselves. Other creatures keened and wailed, flailing uselessly, ranged at the wrong side of the expanding moat as the escaping humans faded into the distance. The stream of images ceased. The vagabonds exchanged glances. Thoughts circulated between them, a label attaching to what they had both seen in their minds. The icon. It has taken form. The vagabonds nodded to each other. The one closer to the creature again turned towards it and raised its long-palmed, human-like hand. The creature dropped in a cloud of ash and dust, briefly holding its shape as it fell, but dissipating into a chalky smear when the breeze caught it. The vagabonds turned as one and walked towards the trees.